May 7th, 1945, 11:47 p.m. Camp Hearn, Texas. The barbed wire caught moonlight like silver threads as Oberstfreiter Klaus Hoffmann pressed his face against the Barak window, watching American trucks roll past on Highway 190. Their headlights blazed without fear, carrying supplies somewhere into the vast Texas night. Behind him, 47 German prisoners of war slept in bunks with clean sheets and wool blankets, luxuries most hadn't known even as free men in the fatherland. 3 months ago, the Red Cross had delivered news that Stuttgart, his home city, had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. His wife and 2 daughters were alive, living in a cellar, surviving on 800 calories a day. Here, in this Texas prison camp, Klaus had gained 15 pounds. The Americans fed him 2,800 calories daily, more than German soldiers had received at the front. Tonight, the war in Europe had officially ended. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of repatriation. Klaus should have felt joy at the prospect of returning home. Instead, he felt dread, because he had seen America, and he knew what awaited him in Germany was something far worse than captivity had ever been. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button. This story will challenge everything you think you know about victory and defeat. The mathematics of human desperation don't appear in official military histories, but they were calculated daily in the hearts of 371,683 German prisoners of war held on American soil between 1943 and 1946. These men had crossed the Atlantic as enemies, expecting brutal treatment in line with Nazi propaganda about American savagery. Instead, they discovered a nation so abundant that even its enemies ate better than German civilians. They worked on farms that produced more food in a single harvest than entire German provinces. They witnessed industrial capacity that made the Ruhr Valley look like a medieval workshop. They experienced a standard of living that revealed every Nazi promise as a hollow lie. For most, repatriation meant returning to a nightmare, a shattered homeland, Soviet occupation, starvation, and the moral horror of discovering what had been done in Germany's name. By the spring of 1946, over 12,000 German prisoners had filed formal petitions with American authorities, begging to remain in the United States. Some cited fear of Soviet persecution. Others spoke of job skills learned in captivity that would be useless in Germany's ruins. Many had fallen in love with American women through correspondence programs. But beneath every petition lay a simpler truth. They had tasted freedom in captivity and couldn't bear to return to oppression as free men. The strategic context of German prisoner repatriation was dictated by international law and geopolitical reality in equal measure. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was unambiguous on the matter. Prisoners of war must be repatriated without delay following the cessation of hostilities. Article 75 specifically prohibited host nations from retaining prisoners for labor or any other purpose once active combat ended. The United States, having built its wartime reputation partly on adherence to international law in contrast to Axis barbarism, could not be seen violating the very treaties it had championed. But the convention's drafters had never anticipated a conflict on the scale of World War II, nor the ideological and geographical complexities that would emerge from its conclusion. By May 1945, Germany itself no longer existed as a functioning state. The nation had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Repatriation couldn't simply mean sending prisoners home. It meant allocating human beings to zones controlled by powers with vastly different political systems and intentions. The State Department's analysis, completed in June 1945, painted a grim picture. The Soviet zone encompassed much of eastern Germany, including Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, regions from which approximately 140,000 of the American-held prisoners originated. These men faced not just the physical devastation of war, but the reality of communist occupation. American intelligence had already documented systematic persecution of returning German soldiers by Soviet authorities. Wehrmacht veterans were viewed as potential counter-revolutionaries. Officers were particular targets, frequently arrested and sent to labor camps in Siberia without trial. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, maintained dossiers on German military personnel, seeking out those who had fought on the Eastern Front. For a German soldier, returning home to the Soviet zone meant trading one form of captivity for another, but without the Geneva Convention protections they had enjoyed in America. The American zones in southern Germany offered marginally better prospects, but the conditions there defied imagination for those who had spent years in the relative comfort of Texas, Oklahoma, or Nebraska. By the summer of 1945, Munich resembled a graveyard of buildings rather than a city. Approximately 60% of all housing had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Clean water was available only at designated pumps. Electricity functioned sporadically, a few hours daily at best. The food situation was catastrophic. Official rations in the American zone provided 1,200 calories per day, technically enough to prevent starvation, but resulting in slow physical deterioration. The black market thrived, but required currency or goods that most Germans no longer possessed. A pound of butter cost 250 marks on the black market, when the average monthly salary for those lucky enough to have work was 120 marks. Medical care was overwhelmed by tuberculosis, typhus, and simple malnutrition. Hospitals had been bombed, doctors were scarce, antibiotics were reserved for occupation forces. In this context, the petition of Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt made practical sense. The 28-year-old Afrika Korps veteran had spent 2 years at Camp Hearn, working on Texas cotton farms, earning 80 cents per day, learning agricultural techniques that had revolutionized his understanding of farming. His petition, filed on September 3, 1945, was typical of thousands. I have acquired skills in mechanized agriculture that would benefit American farmers. I have no family remaining in Germany. My parents were killed in the Hamburg firestorm. My sister is missing. I wish to contribute to American society rather than become a burden on the occupation authorities in Germany. I respectfully request permission to remain in the United States as a permanent resident. His petition was denied on October 12, 1945, with a form letter citing Geneva Convention obligations. Werner Burkhardt was repatriated to Bremen in January 1946. He would spend the next 3 years living in a displaced persons camp, working as manual labor clearing rubble, before finally emigrating to Australia in 1949. His story was replicated thousands of times. Men who had discovered capability and purpose in American captivity, only to be thrust back into a Germany that had no use for them. The women represented a different dimension of the repatriation crisis. By 1945, over 2,300 German prisoners had entered into correspondence relationships with American women, facilitated by church groups and the Red Cross. These relationships, conducted entirely through letters, had resulted in approximately 800 marriage proposals. Some accepted, most complicated by the prisoners' legal status and impending repatriation. The case of Oberstfreiter Hans Muller and Dorothy Richardson became a cause célèbre in the American press during the winter of 1945-46. Muller, captured in Tunisia in 1943, had been assigned to a work detail near Scottsbluff, Nebraska, where he labored on Richardson's family farm. The relationship began through supervised interactions, brief conversations while working, shared meals with the farm family under guard supervision. When Muller was transferred to a different camp in 1944, Dorothy initiated correspondence. By the time of Germany's surrender, they had exchanged 127 letters. She was 23, a teacher who had deferred her career to help run the family farm during the war. He was 26, a former accountant from Hamburg whose entire family had perished in the July 1943 firebombing that killed 37,000 people in a single night. In September 1945, Dorothy Richardson petitioned the War Department for permission to marry Hans Muller and sponsor his immigration. Her petition included affidavits from her family, her church pastor, the local sheriff, and 3 neighboring farmers, all testifying to Muller's character and work ethic. The petition was endorsed by Nebraska Senator Hugh Butler, who wrote, This young German has demonstrated through his conduct as a prisoner that he embodies the values America fought to preserve. To deny him the opportunity to build a life here, with a woman who loves him, serves no strategic purpose and violates the spirit of democratic liberty. The War Department's response, delivered on November 8, 1945, was bureaucratically precise and personally devastating. While the department recognizes the sincerity of Miss Richardson's petition, current law prohibits the marriage of prisoners of war to American citizens. In Geneva Convention obligations require the repatriation of all prisoners without delay following cessation of hostilities. No exceptions can be made. Dorothy Richardson drove 340 miles to Fort Robinson, Wyoming, where Hans was being processed for repatriation, arriving on a freezing January morning in 1946. They were permitted a single supervised meeting, 15 minutes, in the camp commander's office. What they said to each other was never recorded, but witnesses reported that neither spoke for the first 5 minutes. They simply held hand across the desk, weeping. Hans Muller was shipped to New York on January 23, 1946, and repatriated to the British zone of Germany on February 4th. Dorothy Richardson wrote to him weekly for the next 4 years. In 1950, with the Geneva Convention obligations expired and immigration restrictions eased, she traveled to Hamburg, married Hans in a civil ceremony, and brought him to America as her husband. They would farm in Nebraska for 43 years and raise 4 children. Theirs was among the rare stories with happy endings. The mass of petitions revealed patterns that American military psychologists found both troubling and illuminating. The 12,000-plus formal requests to remain represented only the documented cases. Camp commanders estimated that as many as 40,000 prisoners would have requested to stay if they believed there was any realistic chance of approval. The psychological profile of these men challenged American assumptions about German military culture. They weren't the young fanatics, the true believers in Nazism who had fought to the bitter end. Rather, they were the pragmatists, the war-weary, the disenchanted, men who had fought because they were conscripted, not because they believed. Many were older soldiers, men in their 30s and 40s who had families and civilian careers before the war. They had witnessed the contrast between Nazi propaganda and American reality, and they weren't stupid enough to prefer ideology to prosperity. The majority of petitions came from prisoners who had worked in American agriculture, approximately 68% by the War Department's analysis. These men had labored alongside American farmers, witnessed mechanized agriculture that produced yields impossible in Germany, and learned techniques they knew would be useless in a shattered homeland without tractors, without fuel, without intact farms. They had spent their captivity contributing to American abundance. Returning to Germany meant scrounging for survival in cities of rubble. Lieutenant Colonel Paul A. Newland, who directed the Special Project Division responsible for monitoring German prisoner morale, filed a classified report in August 1945 that captured the scope of the crisis. The German prisoners' desire to remain in the United States represents the complete success of American values over Nazi ideology, but it creates a political dilemma we are unprepared to resolve. These men have been our enemies. Their presence on American soil was tolerated only because they were prisoners. To allow them to remain voluntarily would require treating them as immigrants, a status that current law prohibits for enemy aliens, and that public sentiment would not support while American servicemen are still dying in the Pacific. Yet to repatriate them by force, particularly those who face persecution in Soviet zones, seems morally troubling. We have spent 3 years demonstrating American humanity to these prisoners. Now we must demonstrate American law, even when that law produces outcomes that contradict the very values we fought to preserve. The legal architecture preventing German prisoners from remaining in the United States was formidable. The Alien Enemy Act of 1798, still in force, gave the president authority to detain or deport any male over the age of 14 from a nation at war with the United States. The Immigration Act of 1924 had established strict national quotas. Germany's annual allocation was 25,957 individuals. But the law prohibited any German nationals from applying for immigrant status, while America and Germany were technically at war. Even after Germany's surrender, the formal state of war would not be lifted until 1951. Enemy combatants captured in warfare had no path to voluntary immigration under existing statutes. They could be repatriated or theoretically tried for war crimes, but they could not simply decide to stay. The few exceptions required special congressional legislation, which was politically impossible in 1945. The American public, while generally supportive of humane treatment for prisoners, was not prepared to welcome German soldiers as permanent residents while American casualties were still being counted. Veterans organizations, particularly the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars, strongly opposed any accommodation that would allow former enemies to remain on American soil. Their position was emotionally understandable. American soldiers had died fighting these men. To reward them with American residency seemed a betrayal of those sacrifices. Yet private citizens told a different story. The farmers who had employed German prisoners, the families who had corresponded with them, the communities that had interacted with them. These Americans often saw individuals rather than enemy abstractions. In Mexia, Texas, 47 local residents signed a petition requesting that 6 specific German prisoners be allowed to remain and continue working on local farms. The petition was denied, but it demonstrated the disconnect between national policy and local reality. The petitioners knew these Germans by name, had worked alongside them for 2 years, had shared meals and conversations. The abstractions of war and national security meant less than the practical knowledge that Karl was an excellent mechanic, that Wolfgang understood irrigation systems, that Friedrich could repair any farm equipment without formal training. These skills had value in agricultural Texas. They had no value in rubble-strewn Germany. The clock on repatriation was ticking with bureaucratic precision. The War Department had established a target. All German prisoners returned to Europe by July 1, 1946. The logistics were staggering, transporting nearly 372,000 men across the Atlantic, processing them through European ports, allocating them to appropriate occupation zones, all while American forces were simultaneously demobilizing millions of their own troops. The operation required hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of support personnel, and coordination among 4 Allied powers who were already beginning to eye each other with Cold War suspicion. The first major wave of repatriation began in January 1946. Liberty ships that had carried the instruments of Germany's defeat to Europe now carried its defeated soldiers home. The irony was lost on no one. These men had crossed to America in 1943 and 44 aboard vessels they had tried to sink with U-boats. Now they returned on the same class of ships. But the circumstances were reversed. The westbound crossings had carried prisoners who expected brutality. The eastbound journeys carried men who dreaded freedom. Stabsfeldwebel Otto Krebs, formerly a hotel chef in Munich, kept a diary during his repatriation voyage in February 1946. They feed us, well even now, white bread, coffee, stew with meat. The American guards are almost apologetic, as if they know what awaits us. Yesterday, a young corporal from Ohio told me he felt bad about sending us back to that mess. He gave me his ration of cigarettes, said they'd be more useful to me than to him. I tried to thank him, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you thank someone for kindly delivering you to hell? We passed 11 days at sea. The men are quiet, not celebrating return as you might expect. The younger ones, teenagers really, seem almost excited. They remember Germany before the destruction, or they're naive enough to believe recovery will be quick. But those of us older, we know. We've seen American production capacity. We understand what it means that Germany's factories are rubble while America's are expanding. We're sailing toward a future where we'll scrounge for food in a land of ruins, having spent years in a land of plenty. It's a peculiar torture, anticipatory grief for a life we haven't lived yet, but know we'll miss forever. The arrival in European ports stripped away any remaining illusions. Bremerhaven, in the British zone, processed thousands of returnees weekly through facilities that resembled refugee camps more than homecoming centers. The contrast with American camps was immediate and total. The barracks were unheated in the February cold. Food consisted of bread, thin soup, and occasional potatoes, perhaps 1,400 calories daily. Medical screening was cursory. The British occupation authorities were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of displaced persons, refugees, and now repatriated prisoners flooding into their zone. A German soldier returning from American captivity was just one more body to be processed, documented, and dispersed. Oberstfreiter Klaus Hoffmann, whose midnight vigil at Camp Hearn had begun this narrative, arrived at Bremerhaven on February 18, 1946. His processing took 6 hours. Fingerprints, photographs, interrogation about political affiliations, warnings about the consequences of Nazi sympathy. Then he was given a set of ill-fitting civilian clothes, 50 Reichsmarks in nearly worthless currency, a train ticket to Stuttgart, and a pamphlet about denazification procedures. The train journey from Bremerhaven to Stuttgart took 3 days, a trip that should have required 12 hours. The rail system was shattered. Bridges were destroyed. Locomotives were scarce and ran on irregular schedules. Passengers crammed into unheated cars, 200 people in compartments designed for 80. Klaus shared a bench with a woman whose 3 children hadn't eaten in 2 days, a Wehrmacht veteran missing his right arm, and an old man who wept silently for hours, clutching a photograph of a house that no longer existed. Through the train windows, Klaus witnessed the price of defeat in a way his captivity had never permitted. Every major city they passed was a landscape of destruction. Cologne's cathedral stood bizarrely intact amid square miles of rubble. Virtually every other structure reduced to broken walls and collapsed roofs. Frankfurt was 80% destroyed. Mannheim resembled an archaeological dig of a dead civilization. The few people visible on the streets moved with the slow, deliberate motions of the malnourished. They wore layers of mismatched clothing against the cold, anything that could provide warmth. The black market operated openly at railway stations. American cigarettes fetched 5 marks each. A can of Spam, 40 marks. A loaf of bread from American military rations, 30 marks. The occupation authorities tried to suppress these markets, but hunger made law enforcement futile. Stuttgart, when Klaus finally arrived on February 21st, was unrecognizable. The city of his birth, where he had grown up in a modest but comfortable apartment on Hauptstadter Strasse, where he had married Eva in 1938, where his daughters Anna and Sophie had been born, that Stuttgart was gone. The city center was perhaps 40% destroyed. The railway station was a functioning shell. His old neighborhood had been hit by incendiary bombs in September 1944. Of the 12 apartment buildings on his street, 3 remained partially standing. The rest were hollow ruins. He found Eva and the girls living in the basement of what had been a tobacco shop, sharing the space with 6 other families. 34 people total in a room designed as storage. No heat except what could be generated by a makeshift stove cobbled together from scrap metal. No running water. They carried it in buckets from a pump 4 blocks away. No privacy. Sleeping spaces were divided by hanging blankets. Eva had aged a decade in 3 years. She was 29, but looked 45. Malnutrition had left her gaunt, her skin sallow, her hair thinning. The daughters, Anna, 7, and Sophie, 5, were small for their ages, their growth stunted by inadequate nutrition. They looked at Klaus without recognition. He had been gone since they were toddlers, and children's memories don't preserve absent fathers as heroes. The reunion was not joyful. How could it be? Klaus had gained weight in American captivity. He was healthier than his own wife and children. He had clothes without holes, shoes without cardboard insoles, a Red Cross package containing soap, coffee, and chocolate. He was, by the standards of February 1946 Stuttgart, wealthy. But his wealth was measured in goods that would be consumed in days, and then he would be as desperate as everyone else. That first night, as his family slept and he lay awake on the cold floor, Klaus understood the full cruelty of repatriation. For 3 years, he had lived in conditions better than German civilians experienced before the war. He had eaten well, worked productively, learned skills, witnessed a society that functioned with abundance and efficiency. He had seen the future: mechanized agriculture, rural electrification, industrial capacity that produced consumer goods in quantities that seemed magical. And now he was back in the past, a medieval past of hunger, cold, and manual labor. The skills he had learned, tractor operation, irrigation management, crop rotation techniques adapted to American scale, were useless here. There were no tractors. There was barely any land left arable near the cities, and what existed was worked by hand with whatever tools could be salvaged. He could explain in perfect detail how a John Deere Model A could plow 12 acres in a day, but Stuttgart had exactly 0 functional tractors, and the Model A existed only in his memory of Texas fields that seemed, now, like a dream. Klaus's experience was replicated across Germany hundreds of thousands of times. The repatriated prisoners became a destabilizing element in occupation society. Men who had seen what lay beyond Germany's ruins, who understood just how completely the nation had been surpassed. They told stories of American abundance that sounded like fantasy to civilians who had known only wartime scarcity. Initial reactions were skepticism. Surely Klaus exaggerated when he said American prison camps had flush toilets and hot showers. Surely Werner was lying when he claimed that ordinary American farmers owned automobiles and tractors. Surely Hans was delusional when he described Negro workers operating complex machinery. The stories seemed too fantastic, especially coming from men who had been prisoners. Prisoners exaggerate, embellish, make excuses. But gradually, as thousands of repatriated soldiers told similar stories, as letters arrived from German women who had married American soldiers and emigrated, as the contrast between American-zone prosperity and Soviet-zone deprivation became undeniable, the truth sank in. Germany had lost not just a war, but an entire civilization-level competition. The prisoners who had wanted to stay in America were not cowards or traitors. They were realists who had glimpsed the 20th century's future and didn't want to be marooned in its rubble-strewn past. The Soviet zone presented its own nightmares, different in character but equal in intensity. Prisoners repatriated to Soviet-controlled territories faced not just poverty but persecution. The NKVD regarded returnees from Western captivity with institutional suspicion. Perhaps they had been turned, become American spies, been contaminated by capitalist propaganda. Interrogations were standard. Imprisonment was frequent. Unteroffizier Friedrich Racke, who had kept such detailed diaries of his experience in American camps, was repatriated to the Soviet zone in March 1946. His hometown of Königsberg had been annexed by the Soviet Union and renamed Kaliningrad. Germans were being systematically expelled. Friedrich got as far as Berlin's Soviet sector before being arrested by NKVD agents. The charge: collaboration with American intelligence. The evidence: his fluent English and detailed knowledge of American agricultural methods, which the interrogators decided could only have been acquired through espionage training. Friedrich spent the next 7 years in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which the Nazis had built to imprison their enemies and which the Soviets now used to imprison theirs. He was released in 1953, a broken man of 39 who looked 60. He escaped to West Berlin in 1954 and eventually emigrated to Canada in 1957. His American diaries, which he had hidden rather than destroyed, survived and are now in the U.S. National Archives, a testament to promises that American democracy had made to prisoners and that Soviet communism had crushed. The stories of those who tried to escape repatriation are marked by desperation and tragedy. 5 German prisoners successfully evaded repatriation by hiding in remote American locations after being released for work details. Their stories emerged years later when immigration reforms in the 1950s allowed them to regularize their status. Kurt Rosenberg slipped away from a work detail in Montana in December 1945, weeks before his scheduled repatriation. He survived the winter in an abandoned mining camp, eating rabbits and venison. In the spring of 1946, he hiked 60 miles to a German-American farming community in North Dakota, where a family named Schmidt themselves only 2 generations removed from Germany, gave him work and shelter under an assumed name. He lived as Karl Ross for 7 years before the Refugee Relief Act of 1953 provided a path to legal status. He never returned to Germany, never reconnected with whatever family might have survived. Montana had become his home in a way Germany could never be again. Hans-Peter Volkmann, captured in North Africa with the Afrika Korps, had worked on a lumber operation in Oregon. In January 1946, facing repatriation to the Soviet zone where his family had lived, he walked away from a work crew and disappeared into the Cascade Mountains. A forest ranger found him 6 months later, half-starved and suffering from exposure, living in a cave. Rather than report him to authorities, the ranger, himself a German immigrant's son, gave Hans work at a remote fire lookout station. Hans lived there for 4 years, one of the loneliest existences imaginable, before being discovered during an immigration audit in 1950. By then, the urgency of repatriation had passed. He was allowed to stay, eventually became a U.S. citizen in 1960, and worked for the Forest Service until his retirement. He never married, never had children, never fully recovered from his years of self-imposed isolation. But he never regretted his choice. Better alone in America, he told an interviewer in 1983, than with family in a Soviet prison camp. These escapees were extraordinary exceptions. The vast majority of prisoners went home because they had no alternative, because they loved their families more than they feared the future, because they believed in the possibility of German recovery, or simply because they were too tired to resist the bureaucratic machinery of repatriation. By July 1946, the American camps were empty. The last German prisoner had been shipped to Europe. The barracks were dismantled or converted to other uses. Camp Hearn became a Veterans Administration hospital. Fort Robinson returned to its pre-war status as a military training facility. The German prisoners who had walked these grounds, worked these farms, witnessed American abundance. They were gone, returned to a homeland many no longer recognized, and some had never wanted to see again. The final accounting of those 12,000+ petitions to remain makes for grim reading. 0 were granted. Not one single German prisoner was permitted to stay based on personal request. The law was the law. The Geneva Convention was clear. American public sentiment was opposed. Political will was absent. Those petitions, thousands of pages of handwritten testimony to the transformative power of American democracy, were filed away in War Department archives. The men who wrote them were repatriated. Their fates varied wildly based on geography, luck, and personal resilience. Some prospered, relatively speaking. The skills learned in American captivity had value in West Germany's reconstruction. Werner Burkhardt, whose petition had been so eloquently written and so summarily denied, worked clearing rubble in Bremen for 3 years before being hired by a German construction company funded by Marshall Plan dollars. His knowledge of American construction techniques made him valuable. By 1952, he was a foreman. By 1958, he owned his own small construction firm. He never emigrated to Australia as originally planned. Germany, rebuilt with American methods and American money, became tolerable. He never forgot America, never stopped believing it had been a better place, but he made peace with the country fate had assigned him. Others were destroyed. Hans Muller's friend Gerhard Schmidt, also captured in Tunisia, also held at Camp Hearn, also fallen in love with an American woman, was repatriated to Hamburg in February 1946. His fiancée, Mary Patterson of Austin, Texas, wrote to him weekly for 2 years. He wrote back describing unemployment, hunger, the impossibility of building a life. In October 1948, his letters stopped. Mary wrote to the Red Cross, to the American consulate in Hamburg, to the military government. 6 months later, she received notification that Gerhard had died in January 1949, cause of death listed as tuberculosis, which was often a euphemism for starvation-related illness. Mary Patterson never married. In 1987, at age 64, she traveled to Hamburg, located Gerhard's grave in a cemetery that held thousands of unmarked plots, and placed flowers she had carried from Texas. She told a German television crew who happened to be filming a documentary about war memory. "We were supposed to have a life together. But the Geneva Convention was more important than two people's happiness. I understand why. Laws matter, treaties matter. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less." The demographic impact on Germany was significant. The returnees were overwhelmingly male, aged 20 to 40, at precisely the age when men form families and contribute economically. But they returned to a nation where women outnumbered men by approximately 7 million. The casualties of war had been catastrophic. Competition for work was fierce. Housing was scarce. The psychological adjustment from American abundance to German scarcity drove rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among returnees to levels that alarmed occupation health authorities. A study conducted by the American military government in 1947 found that returnees from U.S. captivity had a 40% higher rate of psychological dysfunction than returnees from British or French camps, and dramatically higher than those who had simply been released from German military units at war's end. The explanation was paradoxical. Those who had never left Europe had experienced a continuous decline. The transition from soldier to desperate civilian was harsh but linear. Those who had experienced American captivity had lived through a discontinuous break. 3 years of improving conditions, abundant food, meaningful work, followed by sudden immersion in catastrophe. The psychological whiplash was profound. They were men out of time, carrying memories of a future Germany couldn't yet offer and might never achieve. The Cold War added another dimension of tragedy. By 1948, the division of Germany was hardening from an administrative arrangement into a political reality. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic in 1949. The American, British, and French zones merged into the Federal Republic. The border between them became a frontier between systems, between possibilities. Returnees who had been repatriated to what became East Germany faced a second loss. They had returned from American abundance to German destruction. Now they watched as their cousins in the West, aided by Marshall Plan billions, rebuilt toward prosperity while the East stagnated under Soviet extraction and communist inefficiency. Some tried to escape again, not to America this time, but just to West Germany, where at least the system resembled what they had witnessed in American camps. The East German government, paranoid about population loss, made such escapes increasingly difficult and eventually built a wall to prevent them. The cruel irony was complete. Men who had been prisoners in America and begged to stay were forcibly repatriated to Germany, only to become prisoners again in their own homeland, forbidden to leave. Klaus Hoffmann, whose story has threaded through this narrative, chose not to be one of those trapped. In 1952, with Soviet pressure on Berlin intensifying, he moved his family west to Stuttgart, which was in the American zone, later the Federal Republic. The move required leaving behind his parents, who refused to abandon their home in Saxony. He never saw them again. They died in 1957 and 1959, and he couldn't attend their funerals. Crossing into East Germany risked being trapped there. Klaus found work in Stuttgart's rebuilding automotive industry. His mechanical skills from Texas finally useful. He worked for Daimler-Benz for 31 years, retiring in 1983. He raised his daughters, saw them marry, held grandchildren. He had a life, a good German middle-class life. But until his death in 1997, he kept in his study a photograph of Camp Hearn, Texas, taken in 1945, a sprawling facility of neat wooden barracks against a big sky, a place that had been his prison and his paradise, a place he had begged not to leave and been forced to abandon. The historical echo of those refused petitions resonates through decades of U.S.-German relations. The men who experienced American captivity became informal ambassadors. Their children grew up hearing stories of American fairness, American abundance, American power deployed with restraint. When the Federal Republic oriented itself toward the West, choosing NATO over neutrality, choosing capitalism over socialism, those choices were made easier because a generation of German leaders had witnessed firsthand what American society produced. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on Marshall Plan aid, partly on German discipline and engineering, but also partly on psychological transformation that began in Texas and Oklahoma prison camps. The democratic culture of the Federal Republic was influenced by men who had experienced democracy as prisoners and wanted to create it as citizens. That influence can't be quantified, but it was real. By the 1960s, as West Germany emerged as Europe's economic powerhouse, the bitter irony became apparent. The nation that defeated Germany had also taught Germany how to rebuild. The same methods, the same industrial approaches, the same emphasis on productivity and technological innovation that prisoners witnessed in American farms and factories now characterized German recovery. The students had learned well. Some of those prisoners eventually made it to America after all. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 gradually eased restrictions. By the mid-1950s, former German prisoners could apply for U.S. visas through normal channels. Approximately 5,000 were accepted, immigrated, and became American citizens. They were middle-aged men by then, bringing German wives and German children to start over in the country they had first known as enemies and prisoners. Werner Burkhardt, successful in German construction, never made that leap. Germany had become good enough. But his younger brother Franz did, settling in San Antonio, Texas, in 1956, specifically choosing Texas because Werner's letters from Camp Hearn had described it as a good land. The POW experience created bonds that transcended the war. The American farmers who had employed German prisoners in many cases maintained contact for decades. Christmas cards crossed the Atlantic annually. Some Americans visited Germany, sought out the men who had worked their fields, witnessed the recovery firsthand, and took pride in small personal contributions to reconciliation. Some Germans returned to America as tourists, visiting the camps where they had been held, thanking the families who had shown them kindness when kindness was not required. In 1985, Camp Hearn's former site hosted a reunion. Over 500 former German prisoners returned, now elderly men in their 60s and 70s, accompanied by wives, children, grandchildren. They walked the grounds where barracks once stood, now covered by hospital buildings and parking lots. They shared memories of work details, of guards who had been fair, of American abundance that had shocked them, of learning that enemies could be decent. The local Texas community hosted them with barbecue and music, and if the elderly German men seemed emotional, if they wept while eating Texas beef and listening to country music, it was because they remembered being young and defeated, and America had shown them that defeat didn't have to mean destruction. The mayor of Hearn, Texas, speaking at the reunion, captured something essential. These men came here as our enemies in war. They left as witnesses to our values. They wanted to stay, and we said no, because law mattered, because treaties mattered, because democracy means rules even when they're inconvenient. But they took something with them anyway. They took the knowledge that a free society produces abundance, that diverse people working together create prosperity, that strength permits mercy. They took that knowledge back to Germany and helped build a nation that became our ally and friend. Maybe letting them stay would have been the humanitarian thing, but sending them back turned out to be the historical thing. They rebuilt Germany with American ideas. In the end, we all won. That's one interpretation, the optimistic one that sees rejection transformed into unexpected triumph. But sitting in that audience in 1985 was Mary Patterson, who had never married, and Dorothy Richardson Muller, who had spent 4 years fighting bureaucracy to reunite with her love, and the families of the men who didn't survive repatriation, who died in Soviet camps, or from starvation, or from despair. For them, the story was less tidy. Laws had been followed, yes. Treaties had been honored. But human costs had been paid that no reconstruction, however successful, could reimburse. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had been written to protect prisoners from abuse, to ensure humane treatment, to require repatriation. It had succeeded brilliantly at the first two goals. American treatment of German prisoners was so humane that prisoners begged not to be repatriated. But the third goal, requiring repatriation without delay, had been written for a simpler world, one where prisoners would naturally want to go home. The convention's drafters never anticipated that captivity in one nation might be preferable to freedom in another, that prisoners might be transformed by their experience to the point where their homeland became foreign. The irony cuts deep. The Geneva Convention forced America to act against both its interests and its values. America's interest lay in keeping productive workers who wanted to stay, who had skills, who had been vetted for 3 years and proven their character. America's values emphasized individual choice, the right to pursue happiness, the idea that people could reinvent themselves. But the law was clear, and America's reputation as a law-abiding nation required compliance. So 371,683 prisoners were repatriated, including 12,000 who desperately wanted to stay, who saw their futures more clearly than the bureaucrats who decided their fates. The long-term consequences rippled through generations. The children of repatriated prisoners grew up hearing stories of American abundance. Some developed anti-American resentment, feeling their fathers had been seduced by material comfort and betrayed their homeland. But more, many more, developed pro-American sympathies, understanding that their fathers had witnessed something worth emulating. When those children came of age in the 1960s and 70s, they formed part of Germany's Atlanticist consensus, the political and cultural orientation toward America that defined West German foreign policy. The experience of POWs in America thus influenced German-American relations for half a century after the war, an invisible thread of personal memory woven into diplomatic arrangements. The ultimate fate of those 12,000 petitioners is unrecoverable in detail. They dispersed into the chaos of post-war Germany, and most left no historical trace. We know statistical outlines. Some prospered, some survived, some died young. We have individual stories like Klaus, Werner, Hans, Friedrich, men whose letters or diaries or later interviews preserve their experiences, but most simply vanished into the vast anonymity of history. One more group of displaced persons in a world full of them. What they shared was the knowledge of what might have been. They had glimpsed an alternate life, had held it close enough to taste, and had it snatched away by forces beyond their control. That knowledge was both a curse and a gift. It made adjustment to post-war Germany harder, but it also provided a vision of what Germany could become. The men who knew America existed became, in some cases, builders of a Germany that borrowed American methods. They couldn't live in America, so they tried to create a little America in their corner of Germany. Efficiency, productivity, prosperity. The German economic miracle of the 1950s had many fathers. Marshall Plan aid, currency reform, Ludwig Erhard's economic policies, the discipline of the German workforce. But it also had 371,683 uncredited contributors, men who had witnessed American industrial capitalism at its peak and returned to Germany knowing what was possible. Not all of them contributed positively. Some were too damaged, too bitter. But enough did. Enough brought back knowledge and ambition and a refusal to accept that Germany must remain a wasteland, that the miracle was partly their doing, even if history never recorded their names. In the end, the story of 12,000 German POWs begging to stay in America is a story about the power of lived experience over ideology, about the tragedy of laws that produce outcomes contrary to their spirit, and about the strange pathways through which history moves. These men fought for Hitler's armies, committed to a vision of German supremacy and racial destiny. They were captured, expecting brutality. They were treated with humanity that shattered their worldview. They witnessed abundance that revealed Nazi promises as lies. They wanted to join the society that had defeated them because it had proven superior in every measure that mattered. They were denied, sent back to ruins, and told to rebuild. Most did. Some didn't. All were changed. The Geneva Convention required their repatriation, and so they were repatriated. The law was satisfied. Justice in the narrow legal sense was served. But if we're honest, we must admit that justice in the broader human sense was violated. Men who had been transformed by American values, who had demonstrated through years of good conduct that they deserved a chance, who had found in captivity a freedom they'd never known in their homeland. These men were denied their choice because treaties written for different circumstances permitted no exceptions. They returned to Germany and carried with them a dream of America, a dream that influenced their children and shaped their politics and colored their understanding of what a good society could be. The dream was powerful enough to help transform West Germany from a defeated enemy into a democratic ally. But for the dreamers themselves, those 12,000 men who filed petitions that were denied, the dream remained forever incomplete. A life glimpsed but never lived, a future seen but never inhabited, a home that was never quite home because they had touched a place that felt more like home than home itself ever could. That is the tragedy and the triumph tangled together. Laws upheld at the cost of individual happiness, yet those same laws maintaining a moral order that eventually created a better world. The men who wanted to stay in America couldn't. But America stayed in them, in their memories, their aspirations, their lessons carried back to a shattered nation. They rebuilt Germany with American blueprints, whether they fully realized it or not. And perhaps that was history's plan all along, though it was cruel to the men who lived it. They thought they were asking to stay in America. History made them agents of America's transformation of Germany instead. Unwilling missionaries, they carried the gospel of democratic capitalism back to the land that had rejected it. The message took root. Germany recovered. The mission succeeded. But the missionaries paid a price that no historical success can quite justify. They wanted to stay, and they were sent away, and that wound never fully healed, though it eventually helped heal a nation.